Yes, thank you, Chairman Nadler, and I thank Top Gun himself for deferring to Big Guns so that we could proceed first. I heard the opening statement of the ranking member, and I have great respect for him, and I know he's sincere in his statements. And I would also remind those on the panel that myself, Mr. Rohrbacher, Mr. Nadler, and Mr. Franks apologized publicly to Mr. Arra at an earlier hearing which I chaired over in the Foreign Affairs Committee. But I also would note that in the report by the Inspector General, it stated that the Joint Terrorism Task Force investigators at the time concluded that they had no interest in Arra as an investigative subject. That's the report that is before us today. Something happened afterward. And I would hope that Mr. Skinner would reconsider and reopen his efforts in terms of determining what happened, because I have to acknowledge some disappointment with the new redacted report. I still don't know the answer to two key questions. On what basis did our government determine that it would be prejudicial to the interests of the United States to send Mr. Arra back to Canada? I'm unaware of any designation in terms of Canada that they are a state sponsor of terrorism. Since when and under what circumstances would the United States interests be prejudiced if Mr. Arra returned to Canada? I would suggest that's an offense to our friends, our neighbors, and our erstwhile ally, Canada. And another unanswered question is, what assurances did Syria give that Arra would not be tortured if he were to be sent there? What's the answer to that question? Well, as I indicated, in terms of the first question, I'm baffled because there is no explanation in the report. I don't know whether the Office of Inspector General asked, or perhaps you did, but there was no evidence to provide a justification that it would hurt the interests of the United States to send Mr. Arra back to Canada. I hope we can get to the bottom of that today. On the second point, I read the following line from the redacted report and from your testimony, Mr. Skinner. The assurances upon which INS based Arra's removal were ambiguous regarding the source of authority purporting to bind the Syrian government. Ambiguous regarding the source of authority. How could it be that the Office of Inspector General found that the INS appropriately followed procedures to implement the Convention Against Torture when the assurances were ambiguous regarding the source or the authority? Nor does the report even address my main concern about the assurances, which is how could any assurances from Syria be deemed reliable? This is, after all, the country that President Bush himself cited for its legacy of torture, oppression, misery, and ruin, and that the State Department routinely condemns in its annual country reports for torture. And now we hear that the assurances received from this country were ambiguous to its source and authority? I find that incredulous. How assurances from an unknown source in a government that routinely tortures, according to President Bush, are found sufficiently reliable for purposes of the Convention Against Torture is simply beyond me. I believe the difficulties faced with this report are symptomatic of a larger problem, which is the failure of the Bush administration to come to terms with its own mistakes. Now, the Canadian government has sent an outstanding example of how a healthy, viable, democratic government should act when it commits a mistake. And our government should follow their lead. With that, I yield back.